Joshua Blakeney introduces a book reading by Professor Anthony J. Hall from his recently published text, Earth into Property, Colonization, Decolonization and Capitalism, at the Blackfoot Art Gallery and Gift Shop in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada, January 29th, 2011. So Tony asked me to speak and kind of introduce today's reading by him, and I thought, well, we've done quite a lot together in the last few years, and to speak extemporaneously about this would be a little bit tricky, so I wrote a speech so I could be more accurate about some of the things we've achieved. And I'm mostly going to speak about the stuff that we've done since I entered his class in 2007, but I'll read the speech word for word that I wrote last night. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this book reading today, Saturday, January 29th, 2011, at the Blackfoot Art Gallery in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. We gathered here today to hear the reading by Professor Anthony J. Hall from his recently published text, Earth into Property, Colonization, Decolonization and Capitalism, which constitutes the second volume in a 16-year project which Professor Hall calls The Bowl with One Spoon. The American Emperor in the Fourth World was awarded a prize for Best Non-Fiction Book by an Albertan author in 2004-2005. Earth into Property was recently selected as the UK Independent newspaper as one of the world's best history books in the year 2010. Professor Hall came to Lethbridge to fill the post of historian in Native American Studies in the Native American Studies department when I was only 4 years old. Thus, I can speak more accurately about his achievements in the period since I've known him, which is when I enrolled in his Globalization since 1492 class in the fall of 2007. But to sum up concisely the period before I knew him, I can say that Anthony Hall was born in Toronto, Ontario, Canada in 1951. He attained a PhD in history from the University of Toronto in 1984. His major was in Canadian history and his minor in history of the British Empire. From 1982 to 1989, Professor Hall was employed at the University of Sudbury in the Native American Studies department, and between 1983 and 1987 he attended and participated in 4 constitutional conferences on Aboriginal matters. In 1990, Professor Hall joined the Native American Studies department at the University of Lethbridge. In the pages dedicated to acknowledgements in Earth into Property, Professor Hall writes, Pierre Trudeau and I collaborated in the process that led eventually to the failure of an effort initiated by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney to amend the Constitution of Canada through the addition of legal wording contained in the Meech Lake Accord. The 3-year process to ratify the Meech Lake Accord ended up being derailed in 1990 in Winnipeg at the legislature of the Canadian province of Manitoba. As I see it, Professor Hall realized that as a historian, his role was not merely to document history for the sake of it, but rather to use his knowledge of past historical trends to inform his actions and indeed to make history. As Professor Hall examined the legal and political questions involving the native peoples of Canada, he began to realize the international nature of such questions. Could the Canadian government be both the judge and juror when it came to arbitrating the most important questions about the relationship between the colonized and colonizers in Canada? Or would international third parties need to play the role of arbiter when it came to resolving conflicts between First Nations people and the provincial and federal governments? The global lens through which Professor Hall came to view the struggles of indigenous peoples in North America lent itself also to deconstructing and analysing the struggles of indigenous peoples in, say, Congo, Iraq, Afghanistan, South Africa, and elsewhere. It would be fair to say that Professor Hall has contributed with, say, lawyer Bruce Clark and others to globalizing knowledge of the struggles of indigenous peoples in North America, with the hope that international legal institutions might offer solutions to the domesticated struggles of indigenous peoples in North America. One main achievement of Earth into Property is placing the history of native peoples in North America at the center, rather than the periphery, of the story of the transformation of the American hemisphere from Earth into property since 1492. In both volumes of The Bowl with One Spoon, Professor Hall introduces a slew of original and innovative concepts and ideas. Professor Hall's distinction between what he calls imperial globalization and anti-imperial globalization had a profound impact on my thinking about the world. As colonial powers colonize and displace indigenous peoples, Professor Hall observed, so indigenous peoples are compelled to globalize their resistance if they are to stand any chance of decolonizing their nations. A good example of this would be the Indian National Congress in India, where indigenous peoples of India successfully put aside ethnic and religious factionalism, prioritizing the decolonization of their country over more parochial disputes. Professor Hall uses the example of Tecumseh's Indian Confederacy to illustrate the potential of anti-imperial globalization for indigenous peoples in North America. Perhaps we are seeing the indigenous peoples of North Africa and the Middle East globalizing their resistance to US and Israeli imperial globalization in these current days. In 2001, Professor Hall organized a conference in Quebec City to highlight the hypocrisy of those negotiating a free trade area of the Americas without properly consulting with the indigenous peoples who dwelled in the Americas to ask how they would like to see America reconstituted and redefined. Professor Hall has written, "I was affected professionally myself in 2001 when the so-called National Security Investigation Section of the RCMP intervened in my place of work to interrogate me on campus concerning a conference I had planned in Quebec City on indigenous peoples and the proposed free trade area of the Americas." Thus, Professor Hall's commitment in his scholarship to attempt to alleviate the suffering of indigenous peoples globally has not always been the most expedient and economically gratifying path to take in life. Nonetheless, his scholarship and track record indicate that he has been a thorn in the side of those who need thorns in their sides in this benighted planet. In 2002, Professor Hall successfully pitched the idea of establishing a new academic unit called Globalization Studies at the University of Lethbridge. I enrolled in Professor Hall's 2 classes in the academic year of 2007-2008. I also had a foot in Indian country as I had been staying for extended periods of time on the Blackfoot Indian Reservation in Montana each summer since the year 2001 while my mother completed graduate research. I had also participated in anti-war and anti-George Bush marches in London prior to emigrating to Canada in 2005. Thus, Professor Hall and I had some shared interests and commitments which converged via our student-professor relationship. One propaganda meme of the corporate media, which is implicitly debunked in Professor Hall's globalization studies classes, is the notion that somehow one is anti-globalization if they oppose the globalization of poverty, exploitation, and corporate colonialism. Professor Hall emphasizes the need for universal human collaborations, people's globalization, and the fruition of anti-imperial globalization among the different nations and peoples if we are to find solutions to the problems caused by the unfettering of capitalism after the defeat of Soviet-style communism in the early 1990s. As Professor Hall's student, I particularly admired the way he utilized the internet as a medium of globalization to facilitate provincial, national, and international dialogue with people who were unable to be in Lethbridge physically, but who, thanks to the internet, could be brought into the class via video conferencing equipment. If you visit globalizationstudies.ca website, you can find a vast archive of most of the video conferences Professor Hall has conducted. One notable set of video conferences which I participated in were between Poland and Lethbridge. And Professor Hall went to Poland and taught the class from Poland, which is good. And, so around the 2007-2008 period, Professor Hall and I discussed at length the burgeoning academic field of 9/11 studies. Professor Hall and I concurred after consulting with some of the vast body of literature authored by Professors David Ray Griffin, Peter Dale Scott, Nafiz Ahmed, John McMurtry, Graham McQueen, and others, that 9/11 studies was worthy of our collective and individual attention. I think it was both brave and honest of Professor Hall to dedicate a substantial part of Chapter 13 in Earth into Property to acknowledging the substantial body of scholarship which brings into question the official narrative of what transpired on September the 11th, 2001. Professor Hall distinguishes himself from many of his peers who have, for one reason or another, failed to comprehend the vast body of literature helping to distinguish fact from fiction vis-à-vis 9/11. After I completed Professor Hall's 2 classes, I committed to helping him however I could to use the medium of the internet to advance certain shared political and pedagogical goals, including the quest for 9/11 truth, a necessary prerequisite to ending the 9/11 wars being waged primarily against indigenous peoples in the Middle East and Eurasia. We discovered the possibility of conducting an applied study collaboratively as part of my undergraduate degree. I think Professor Hall would agree that if one epithet could sum up the ethos of globalization studies, it would be applied studies. Professor Hall's pedagogical methodology answers Karl Marx's credo that philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. I'm nearly finished. So much to say in so little time. Right, luckily for me, Professor Hall had in a previous incarnation produced films. In the applied studies which we collaborated on, we asked ourselves how best to shape traditional text-based research on the internet. Professor Hall and I set ourselves the goal of trying to, for example, produce YouTube videos which might be considered scholarly or even peer-reviewed. After all, most people get their information from YouTube nowadays. Was the Academy to ignore or embrace this development? Professor Hall has endeavoured to use the new media to fuse traditional text-based studies with the contemporary modes of conveying knowledge on the web with much success. I hope you might visit our YouTube channel, which is entitled Globalization 1492, where you can see our collection of YouTube videos. Professor Hall has many articles published online, and I encourage you to Google his name and read them as well. Recently, Professor Hall did a similar event to this one at the Six Nations Reserve, close to Brampton, Ontario. His lecture engendered a fruitful dialogue with many members of the audience asking intelligent questions and making profound statements. Professor Hall and I would be most grateful if you would feel comfortable to contribute both questions and statements so as to make this book reading as constructive as possible. If you have any questions about some of the concepts or themes touched on in this lecture, you are encouraged to ask Professor Hall for clarification. And without further ado, please put your hands together for Professor Hall.
Thank you so much, Joshua, for that very thoughtful and comprehensive introduction. Joshua's MA thesis is on the origins of the global war on terror, and we're looking at academic debates and interpretive controversies in that MA thesis, which Joshua is just now starting to read up, prepare for writing it. And in that subject, with respect to that subject, I see what I'm calling the 9/11 wars as kind of a continuation of the Indian Wars, that indigenous peoples in another part of the world, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, are being characterized as terrorists, as somehow subhuman, and the narrative is to go in and on the claim that this is about elevating people towards democracy and overcoming backwardness and savagery. And we've heard that kind of rationale before, and we know that although that was the rationale given for the taking of the resources, that the real motivation was just that, was appropriating riches in a place that was seen as a treasure chest, and the indigenous peoples were considered to be expendable and were moved aside. And so I'm trying to show the continuity, that this same narrative, that this same kind of justification continues now in the name of the global war on terror. This is a fantastic venue, and thank you so much, Marianne Crow-Healy, for inviting me here, for setting up this event. And I congratulate you on the excellent work you've been doing in the International Powwow, in the Blackfeet Awards, which I attended last spring. And I'm proud to sit here amidst many of the fantastic artworks of a Native American Studies student, Kerry Scott. And you'll notice that he's tried to create images and has successfully created images that speak of different eras of history. For instance, the era when the sun dance was treated as superstition and kind of communion with the devil. The era of the boarding schools, which is connected to that. You'll see different images that show how people have endeavored to address these dark spots and reassemble a conception and a way of life that is being renewed and will not succumb to a kind of death sentence which the dominant society tends to put on indigenous peoples.